Timothy Leary arrived at California Men's Colony Prison in 1970, facing 20 years behind bars. He was 50 years old, a former Harvard psychologist turned counterculture icon, sentenced for marijuana possession in an era when the establishment treated drug advocacy as existential threat. Prison officials processed him like any other inmate. Fingerprints, prison blues, a psychological evaluation to determine security placement. Then they handed him the test. Leary looked at the questions and recognized his own work. Years earlier, during his respectable academic career, he'd developed the Leary interpersonal behavior inventory, personality assessment designed to evaluate how people relate to authority, handle stress, and respond to institutional control. Now the same system he'd created was being used to classify him. He filled out the questionnaire in under 10 minutes, deliberately shaping his answers to present exactly what the evaluators wanted to see. A middle-aged man with no fight left, interested in gardening and forestry, compliant, unlikely to cause trouble. The results placed him in minimum security with an assignment tending the prison gardens. Leary had just manipulated his own psychological test to engineer the conditions for his escape. He wasn't always a rebel. Timothy Leary started as an establishment academic, exactly the kind of psychologist Harvard hired in 1959, expecting orderly research and publishable papers. He'd earned his PhD from Berkeley, directed psychiatric research at Kaiser Foundation Hospital, published respected work on personality assessment. His career trajectory pointed toward tenure and professional respectability. Then he went to Mexico in the summer of 1960 and tried psilocybin mushrooms. The experience didn't just alter his consciousness, it altered his understanding of what psychology could be. He returned to Harvard convinced that psychedelic compounds offered therapeutic potential that traditional psychiatry couldn't match. He started the Harvard Psilocybin Project, conducting research with graduate students, prisoners, and intellectuals. Subjects included Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and religious scholars. They took controlled doses, wrote detailed reports, participated in therapeutic sessions. The research was legitimate, the methodology was sound, but the implications terrified administrators who saw a professor encouraging students to chemically alter their perception of reality. Colleagues whispered about loss of scientific objectivity. Newspapers sensationalized the experiments. By 1963, Harvard decided Leary had become a liability. They fired him, officially for leaving campus during the semester without authorization. But everyone understood the real reason. He'd stopped being a respectable psychologist and become something the institution could uncontrol. Leary saw the dismissal as liberation. Freed from academic constraints, he became the public face of psychedelic exploration. He traveled, lectured, founded research centers, first in Mexico, then in Millbrook, New York. He coined phrases that became counterculture mantras: turn on, tune in, drop out. Critics heard nihilism. Followers heard permission to question inherited assumptions about consciousness, authority, identity. The establishment heard threat. In 1965, authorities arrested him at the Texas-Mexico border for marijuana possession. Prosecutors pushed for harsh sentencing, treating him as a symbol of cultural decay that needed crushing. Leary fought back through the legal system. He appealed all the way to the Supreme Court and won not through cultural arguments about drug policy, but through constitutional law. The court ruled in Leary v. United States that the marijuana tax law he'd been charged under violated the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination. But victories in court didn't stop the targeting. In 1968, police arrested him again in Laguna Beach. Combined with his previous offense, he now faced 20 years in prison. This time, there would be no Supreme Court rescue. Once transferred to the minimum security facility at California Men's Colony, Leary began planning the impossible. The Weather Underground, a radical leftist organization, agreed to help for $25,000 paid by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a group of psychedelic advocates. They smuggled him tools and coordinated logistics for a nighttime escape. On September 13, 1970, Leary climbed onto a prison rooftop, pulled himself up a telephone pole, and moved hand over hand along a cable spanning the prison yard over barbed wire, over security perimeter, beyond what guards thought anyone would attempt. He dropped to the road outside, where Weather Underground operatives waited. He left behind his prison clothes and a note that reportedly read, "I declare myself free." The escape became international news. Prison officials found themselves explaining how one of America's most recognizable prisoners had simply climbed out while they watched. Leary fled to Algeria, where he stayed briefly with Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver's government in exile, then Switzerland, then Afghanistan. He traveled under assumed names, gave lectures in disguise, wrote manifestos. Intelligence agencies tracked him across continents. He became a fugitive philosophy professor. The chase ended in 1973 when Afghan authorities, working with American intelligence, arrested him in Kabul. He returned to the United States in handcuffs. Newspapers framed it as law finally catching up with chaos. Leary framed it differently. In interviews, he emphasized that the real threat was on psychedelics. It was the questions they made. People ask about who controlled their consciousness and why. He served additional years in prison, during which he wrote extensively about neurology, consciousness, and human potential. When finally released in 1976, he didn't retreat into quiet obscurity. Instead, he evolved. He lectured on cyberculture before most people understood what the internet would become. He talked about space colonization, artificial intelligence, consciousness expansion through technology. He refused to become a museum piece from the 1960s, choosing instead to adapt his message to new frontiers. Critics dismissed him as a relic trying to stay relevant, but Leary understood something fundamental: the questions he'd been asking about autonomy, consciousness, institutional control, who decides what's acceptable to think and feel, didn't stop being important just because the decade changed. Near the end of his life in the 1990s, still lecturing and writing, someone asked why he'd spent decades provoking institutions that imprisoned him, surveilled him, tried to silence him. Why keep pushing when the cost had been so high? Leary's answer captured everything about his approach to authority, consciousness, and control. The moment you stop questioning, somebody else starts answering for you, because that was the real story of Timothy Leary. Not the drugs, not the slogans, not the escapes. It was his refusal to let anyone else define the boundaries of acceptable thought. He'd figured out how to game a psychological test because he understood how institutions try to categorize and control people. He'd escaped from prison because he understood that the only real prison is the one you accept. He'd kept questioning authority because he understood that the alternative wasn't safety, it was surrender. The establishment called him dangerous. Leary called them predictable. And in 1970, when they handed him his own test, thinking they'd finally contained him, he proved exactly how predictable they were.